My name is Dr. Harvi Millar. I wanted to meet some doctoral students before I left Strathmore, but I met a number of students, very keen, very exciting to talk to, but they already have supervisors. My goal was to meet with new students who have yet to either establish exactly what they want to study in terms of a thesis topic, and maybe also looking for a supervisor. So either you could have an idea and looking for a supervisor, don't have an idea, looking for an idea and a supervisor. And so let me just tell you a little bit about myself, because as an adjunct professor, I am able to supervise or co-supervise graduate students at Strathmore. So let me tell you a little bit about myself and what I'm interested in. Okay, so let's just go ahead. So my background is that I'm actually an industrial engineer. I graduated in 1982 with a Bachelor of Science, upper second class honors in industrial engineering, and then proceeded to Canada from the Caribbean because my first degree was at the University of the West Indies, and got a scholarship from the Canadian government to pursue a master's degree in industrial engineering in Canada. So I went to Nova Scotia in 1982 and graduated in 1984. My thesis topic was production lot size planning models for a flexible manufacturing cell. We wanted to look at in flexible manufacturing systems, you could reduce batch sizes because of the sort of short changeover times, and as a result you could get greater efficiency from operating with small batches as opposed to large batches to get economies of scale. For my doctoral thesis, I looked at production planning systems, yes, but in the context of industrial fishing. My topic focused on trying to develop a framework or model that would assist an industrial fishing firm with planning its operations in terms of catching fish, processing the fish, and marketing the fish. So the company had demands for different types of fish products. The fish products can be produced from different stocks of raw fish, and different plants had different capabilities. The company had multiple plants, but the company also had multiple fishing vessels. And so the company had to determine what was the best place to catch fish, what kind of fish it should catch, which plants the fish should be landed at and processed, and what products it should make from that. And so that was the framework that I worked on and completed that in 1990. Since then, I began teaching at St. Mary's University in Halifax, www.smu.ca. And I went to the business school, and there I taught quantitative courses. So industrial engineers have an overlap with business programs in the quantitative methods area, where we can teach statistics, intraquants, production management, computer simulation, management science, decision models, and so on. So, and total quality management. So these are some of the courses that if you look here, you'll see that I actually taught. Operation strategy gives you a sense of the area that I generally like to operate in. Statistics, production operations management, computer simulation of industrial systems, manufacturing processes, management science, where we use mathematics to model decision problems, and then production planning and inventory management and total quality management. So these are some of the areas. In terms of my employment history, so currently I'm employed as a full professor at the Sobey School of Business at St. Mary's University, but I'm also now an adjunct professor at the Strathmore Business School. I did do 2 stints as the director of the MBA program, in our MBA program. I've also taught in the executive MBA program as well as undergrad and MBA. I was an associate professor between 1994 and 2002, an assistant professor between 1989 and 1994. Prior to that, I spent a year as a lecturer in 1988 to 1989. I have a number of publications that span different areas, simulation, in looking at industrial fishing. So a number of the early publications were in looking at industrial fishing operations, where we dispatch fishing fleets, or we determine what production quantities we should produce of different types of products based on the kind of fish that we caught. We looked at determining where fish should be caught, how much should be caught, and which plants it should be landed at. We've also expanded my interest in terms of looking at production planning models in manufacturing settings, where we have back orders and cases where we do not have back orders. So you could see here developing algorithms or heuristics. So kind of on the management science side, a lot of this has to do with management science. That is using mathematics to model decision problems and then trying to find effective ways to solve them. So you could see capacity and multi-item lot sizing problems, application of Lagrangian decomposition. So these are all mathematical based models. All right. As you could see, doing simulation, and then we even did a project on selecting road paving projects using goal programming. So again, applying management science to specific problems. I'm looking at things like inspection policies in terms of lead time performance in flexible manufacturing systems. We could see planning an annual allocation of fishing surveillance efforts. So the departments of fisheries and oceans, they needed to survey, to provide surveillance patrol for the fishery so that it wouldn't be overfished. If you overfish the fishery, then eventually you affect the livelihood of many fishers. And so you need to protect the stocks. And how do they do that effectively? If you go down a little lower, we'll see that I have a paper here with a colleague from Kenya, Muna Kiragu, who currently lives in Canada, and we did we sort of worked on a problem on the traveling salesman problem, a very special version of that traveling salesman problem. And then we also did another paper on scheduling of 12-hour shift nurses. So there's a whole bunch of material that I've produced that have to do with applying mathematics to management science problems. Okay. I also have an interest in disaster recovery planning. So as you can see from this first paper right here, that we develop a decision model for disaster recovery. Also, routing of offshore fishery surveillance. We looked at that as well. Manufacturing strategy is an operation strategy is an area I have an interest, so we studied that in the Caribbean. We look at the adoption of sustainable manufacturing practices among Caribbean manufacturers, and I would like to look at that among Kenyan manufacturers. Also look at the outsourcing practices and whether or not there's a relationship between how the companies outsource and the sort of supply chain performance. So those of you who might have an interest in supply chain management, we've done some things in that area. If I were to continue, that there are some other research reports that I've been involved in producing, had to do with sustainable manufacturing in Atlantic Canada, manufacturing practices in the Southern Caribbean, looking at a sort of a framework for allocating strategic resources in the Department of Fisheries and Oceans. So again, just applying frameworks for decision making, and then looking at fisheries law enforcement and so on. So these are some topics that I've worked on. Recently, I started working on entrepreneurship. In particular, we are studying Black entrepreneurship in Canada and some of the challenges that Black entrepreneurs face, and how we could first understand the problem, but then two, use the results from our studies to propose policy changes at the government level to enable entrepreneurs to thrive and succeed and thrive. Okay, so in terms of the kind of topics that I'm interested in, I'm open to entrepreneurship, I'm open to supply chain management, I'm open to even looking at self-checkout systems and how the rate of adoption and the challenges to adoption in a Kenyan environment. I understand that slowly is being introduced. In other parts in the West, self-checkout systems have become fairly prevalent, but it's not without its challenges. So if that has been introduced in Kenya, then what kinds of challenges are being faced in terms of the introduction of self-checkout systems? All right. So typically, the kind of student I look for should have a decent quants background, because my background is in engineering, industrial engineering, and I like models and quantitative analysis. The kind of more qualitative studies is not part of my strong suit. So I would like someone who has, or students who have decent quants background in order for the mathematics. It doesn't have to be heavy duty mathematics, but at the very least be able to understand some statistics, do some data collection, do the analysis, draw graphs, look at trends, and analyze that and so forth. Got to be a logical, critical thinker and willing to establish norms. We're not trying to replicate what's there. Sometimes we want to create something new and different. As a creative mind, if you're multidimensional, yes, you have academic interests, but you also have artistic interests. I like that because I really do believe that we need to be multidimensional or unidimensional. And so, if you do drama, sculpture, music, fine art, or some other kind of hobby, whether it's farming, fishing, but be multidimensional, not just a bookworm. Right, it's self-directed because living in Canada, yes, we will have Zoom meetings and so on, but the person should be someone who could work fairly independently. Once they're given some instructions, they could go at it and then come back with some results. Who knows how to learn? If you're not sure about something, that you take the initiative to discover what you need to know. You could ask questions, of course, but I do not want somebody to have to supervise literally on a weekly basis. Thinks in terms of models and frameworks, who could see things from a systems point of view, a big systems point of view, and how things interconnect, as opposed to very narrowly thinking about a problem. And then appreciates and applies metaphorical thinking on cognitive methods. What I mean by that is you could see metaphors. You could use metaphors to generate ideas. So if I said to you, let's look at Mount Kenya, and then as a metaphor for a solution approach, that you could actually figure out an approach to a problem or a challenge by using Mount Kenya as a metaphor, or the Kilimanjaro as a metaphor. All right? So here's some interest that I have. On the operations management science side of things, operations strategy. So looking at the competitive priorities of and the relationship between competitive priorities and business performance in Kenyan manufacturing firms. What do I mean by competitive priorities? So the operations infrastructure of any organization has to create or produce certain outcomes or outputs and outcomes. And depending on what those are, those enable a company to succeed in a competitive market if the company is competing, or at least achieve its mission. So what's the relationship between the operation strategy, right, and the performance of the firms? What kind of operation strategy do Kenyan manufacturing firms deploy? Is it largely based on costs? Is it based on flexibility, speed, differentiation? So we need to be able to identify the competitive strategy and then see how the operations infrastructure supports that. And is there a relationship between the kind of strategy adopted by firms and how well they perform? Okay. Sustainable manufacturing practices. We hear a lot about sustainability, but then are manufacturing firms applying these concepts? Are they adopting sustainable practices? And if they are, do we see a relationship with their bottom line performance? So that's another thing we want to look at. Also, we want to look at it in general in terms of supply chain practices. So you can focus on sustainable practices in terms of the supply chain, but also in terms of your manufacturing processes. So there's two slightly different things, but related. So your manufacturing processes and whether or not you're practicing sustainability there, or in terms of your supply chain, in terms of who your suppliers are and what kinds of agreements you have with them with respect to environmental sustainability. Right. Production plan and distribution in agro industries. I have an interest in looking at the agro-industrial sector and seeing what are some of the challenges in a Kenyan context, and then how can we model some of these problems and try to solve them. Modeling affordable housing decisions, the idea that maybe the government may want to have certain developments and it has multiple options in terms of the types of housing to provide. But then you have demand from people who want to own homes, and you want to make sure that you satisfy the demand as much as possible, but at the same time maximize the amount of stock that you produce from your limited budget. So how do we balance those two things? Because consumers have preferences, certain types of housing that they want, that they will purchase. Government has a certain amount of money and it wants to maximize the available stock, but it has to be able to sell them as well. So there has to be a match between the demand and the supply. Planning and scheduling of rotating interns in a Kenyan teaching hospital. So this was a problem we worked on a long time ago when schools of medicine are trying to give the interns exposure. They run them through different programs: obstetrics, gynecology, radiology, and so forth, internal medicine, and they have to complete, each intern has to complete a program before they can graduate. And sometimes scheduling them based on the demand at different hospitals or clinics and so on, rural, urban, etc. It could be a bit of a challenge developing the schedule. So if that's an area that we want to look at, how can we assist a particular teaching school with that particular problem by modeling their specific problem and finding solutions to it. Indigenizing leadership practices in African organization. This is really a particular interest to me. I do believe that a lot of our modern managers who study abroad tend to ignore the wisdom that's available in terms of if you want to call it tribal wisdom, or the wisdom of our elders, etc., and information that has been passed on for generations. But we tend not to look there as a source of inspiration, as a source of guidance, and we focus on what we've learned in our texts, from all the management gurus and the leadership gurus and so on. But if we could leverage indigenous practices, we could create unique organizations that allow us to be successful. And I'm interested in how can we take our leadership practice and indigenize it by using knowledge from our elders, or knowledge that has been passed on either through proverbs and other means and so forth. All right. We are studying entrepreneurship, black entrepreneurship in Canada, and it would be nice to do comparative studies. So we could look at the experience of black entrepreneurs in Canada, and if we juxtapose that in a Kenyan context, does our location play a critical role, and the kind of environment, the operating environment, to what extent that influences success, particularly if we're comparing similar types of businesses. There are many factors: the market, the clientele or customer base, the knowledge, of the entrepreneurs themselves, the authenticity, the kinds of products they're selling. There's so many factors. We may want to do a comparison between a Canadian context and an African context. The related topic to the indigenizing of leadership practices is the idea of African cultural aesthetics in organizations. All organizations have a culture. And then the question is, what kind of culture exists in the organization? So I do believe that, in terms of an organization existing on the continent, should reflect an African aesthetic. not a Western aesthetic based on what we've learned by being educated in the West or adopting curriculum from the West, but actually having a cultural aesthetic that is uniquely African, or at least a hybrid. So how can we create an African cultural aesthetic in our organizations? And we can look at our artifacts, we can look at our policies, our practices. So you hear about in South Africa the whole concept of Ubuntu, and how Ubuntu is being used to influence HR policies, right? That is creating an African aesthetic in the context of the human asset management of the company. So how can we apply that to our processes, to our systems, our data, our relationships with customers, customer relationship management, all of these things. So how do we reflect an African cultural aesthetic in an organization as we attempt to design it for its mission or renew it for better performance, right? And then and related to that is leveraging African art and science in strategy implementation. So when we have a strategic plan to implement, when we approach implementation, there are particular processes and models that we can use. But are those processes and models reflective of the culture of the people who are trying to implement them? So in an African context, how do we ensure that the approach that we use for strategy implementation is reflective of African culture? So if we look at art and science, can we leverage that intersection between African art and science in strategy implementation? So these are some of the topics that I'm interested in. And then, of course, I'm sure that there are others. If someone comes to me for an idea and says, hey, this is what I'm planning on doing, I can assess to what extent I have the capacity to be able to guide that individual. So I'm open as well. But I'm just suggesting that these are some things that I have a special interest in. So I'm hoping that some of you might find that useful. So I wanted to share this video with you because some of you were not there. And so this is an opportunity for you to get a sense of what I'm interested in. And then you are able to contact me through the organization, right? My email address is relatively easy. It's hmillar, MILLAR, at strathmore.edu, or you can email me at Harvi, HARVI, .millar, MILLAR, at smu.ca. That's my email address where I currently work. Okay, thank you very much, and looking forward to hearing from you. So we will stop.